The air in the grand atrium smelled of expensive perfume and cold indifference. Marcus moved through the mall like a man who owned the sunlight streaming through the skylights, fast, sharp, and utterly blind to anyone he deemed beneath him. Then, he saw her. To Marcus, she wasn't a person, she was an obstacle. A woman in a faded coat, moving too slowly, clutching a small paper bag as if it held the world. In a fit of characteristic, casual cruelty, Marcus didn't just step around her. He shoved her. The violence was sudden. Her shoulder snapped back, and she stumbled, crashing into a crystal display case. The sound of her fall, the sickening thud of a body against glass, echoed louder than a scream. The mall froze. "Watch where you're going," Marcus spat, his voice dripping with the same poison he'd used years ago when he threw her out like trash. "This isn't a place for people like you." He looked down, ready to savor his dominance, but the sneer died on his lips. As she looked up, the harsh afternoon light acted like a spotlight of judgment. The poorly dressed woman was Sarah. The same Sarah he had abandoned and called worthless. The same Sarah he had left with nothing but the clothes on her back. But Sarah didn't cry. She didn't beg. She simply stood up, dusting off her coat with a calm that felt more terrifying than anger. She picked up her small paper bag, unbroken. "You haven't changed, Marcus," she said softly. Her voice wasn't weak, it was heavy with a pity that made his skin crawl. "You still think the world belongs to those who shout the loudest." Marcus laughed, a hollow, defensive sound. "And you're still a nobody. What are you going to do? Call the mall security?" "No," she replied, her eyes flicking toward the entrance where a fleet of black sedans had just pulled onto the curb. "I think I'll just let my husband handle the bill for that broken glass." The glass doors hissed open. A man stepped in, flanked by a silent, stone-faced detail. He was a figure whispered about in the highest circles of the city, a Korean power broker whose influence could dismantle a man's entire life with a single phone call. The man ignored the crowd, ignored the chaos, and went straight to Sarah. He took her hand, his expression shifting from cold granite to absolute devotion. "Are you hurt?" the man asked. "I'm fine, Minho," Sarah whispered. "But this gentleman was just reminding me of who I used to be." The power broker turned his gaze toward Marcus. In that moment, the bright, expensive mall felt very, very small. Marcus realized too late that while he had been busy stepping on people to feel tall, the woman he discarded had become the earbeat of a kingdom he couldn't even enter. Before we dive into a journey that will change the way you look at every stranger you pass, take a moment to like, comment, and subscribe. If you believe that kindness is a superpower and that everyone deserves a second chance, this story is for you. Amara Cole walked through the Grand Mall, but she wasn't seeing the sparkling storefronts or the families laughing near the food court. To her, the marble floors felt like ice. Years ago, this very place was the site of her greatest humiliation. She remembered the soft mall music playing, a haunting contrast to the moment her world shattered. She had once walked these halls holding the hand of Victor Hale, a man who promised her a sanctuary of love but delivered a prison of fear. To Victor, Amara was invisible. She was a shadow he could cast aside when she no longer served his ego. The memory of that day, the day he shoved her into the light and walked away while she was at her lowest, pressed down on her like a second gravity. But Amara carried a secret. Underneath the quiet exterior of the woman Victor called worthless, was a spirit forged in fire. She didn't just survive the abandonment, she transformed. Through tears and sweat, she rediscovered her roots, blending her heritage into a form of kung fu that was as beautiful as it was lethal. She found empathy for her past self and hope for her future. She wasn't just a survivor anymore, she was a master of her own destiny, waiting for the moment the sun would finally shine on her terms. They say the universe has a way of bringing people back to where they started to see if they've truly grown. As Amara stood under the same bright skylights where she once fell, she saw a familiar silhouette approaching. It was Victor. Still arrogant. Still blind. He didn't recognize the poised, powerful woman standing before him. He only saw another obstacle in his path. But this time, the sunlight didn't feel like a judgment, it felt like a spotlight. Amara wasn't the broken girl on the floor anymore. She was the storm that was about to break his silence. Amara Cole became an expert at being invisible. After Victor Hale threw her out, casting her aside like a worn-out coat once his business empire took flight, Amara vanished into the gray machinery of the city. To the world, she was just another face in the crowd. To herself, she was a soul in survival mode. The years that followed didn't just pass, they carved her. They sculpted her with the precision of a master artist, but the tools were hardship and hunger. Every morning, long before the sun touched the city's glass towers, Amara was at the bakery. The scent of warm yeast and sugar was her constant companion, a beautiful irony for a woman who was learning the grim mathematics of poverty, calculating exactly how to stretch a single meal across an entire day. By afternoon, she was scrubbing the grime from office windows, watching powerful people live lives she once thought she belonged to. She didn't have a home, she had transit points. First, the shelters, where the air was heavy with the shared breath of 100 broken dreams. Then, finally, a tiny rented room. The paint was cracked, peeling back like old skin, and the floorboards groaned under her weight. But every night, as she sat in the dark, she whispered a truth that kept her heart beating. Surviving is not the same as living, but it is the road that led there. Amara moved through the world with a quiet, observant empathy. She saw the cruelty of those who felt superior, and the sudden, breathtaking kindness of strangers, the bus driver who waited an extra second, the street vendor who, accidentally, gave her an extra apple. These small moments were her oxygen. They taught her to keep her eyes steady and her voice soft. She stopped being a victim of her circumstances and started becoming a student of them. The most profound change, however, was internal. In those long, lonely years, Amara did something most people never manage: she stopped waiting. She stopped waiting for the phone to ring. She stopped waiting for a headline to announce Victor's downfall. Most importantly, she stopped waiting for the apology that she knew, in her heart, would never come. She realized that holding onto resentment was like drinking poison and waiting for the other person to die. Instead, she traded her bitterness for discipline. She found an old martial arts dojo in the heart of the Afro-Korean district, a place that smelled of sweat and ancient wood. There, she discovered the kung fu legacy of her lineage. She realized her body wasn't a fragile thing to be broken, it was a weapon to be honed. Every strike she practiced was a release of a memory. Every block was a boundary she set against the world. She wasn't just training to fight, she was training to be whole. 5 years later, the sunlight changed. It no longer felt like a spotlight of judgment, it felt like an old friend. Amara walked into the Grand Mall, the very place where Victor had once humiliated her, but she didn't feel the gravity of the past. She wore her strength like a silent melody. She was poised, her movements fluid and certain. As she stood near the fountain, a man rushed past, nearly knocking into her. He stopped, his eyes widening as he took in the striking, powerful woman before him. It was Victor. He looked the same: expensive watch, frantic eyes, a soul clearly still chasing a ghost. He looked at Amara, and for a second, a flicker of recognition crossed his face, followed quickly by confusion. He saw a woman of immense awe-inspiring presence, someone who looked like she owned the very air she breathed. "Do I know you?" he stammered, drawn to her energy but unable to reconcile this queen with the invisible girl he had discarded. Amara smiled, and for the first time in 5 years, it was a smile of pure gratitude. Not for him, but for the journey. "You knew a version of me that needed your permission to exist," she said, her voice calm and unshakable. "That girl is gone. I'm the one who stayed behind to build something better." She walked away, the sound of her heels steady on the marble. She didn't look back to see his reaction. She didn't need to. Every secret was out, every debt was paid, and Amara Cole was finally, truly, living. Before we begin this journey of resilience and the ultimate karma payoff, take a moment to like and subscribe if you believe that no matter how many times life knocks you down, you were born to rise. Amara Cole became a ghost in the very city she once called home. When Victor Hale cast her out under the scorching afternoon sun, he didn't just take her home, he took her identity. The years that followed were not a story of sudden glory, but a grueling, quiet war against despair. Amara learned the geometry of hunger. She worked dawn shifts at a local bakery, the smell of fresh bread a cruel irony as she learned how to stretch a single meal across an entire day. By the time the sun hit its peak, she was scrubbing the marble floors of high-rise offices, floors very much like the ones Victor walked on. To the people who hurried past her, she was just the cleaning lady. She was invisible. But in that invisibility, Amara found a strange, shimmering hope. She spent her nights in shelters, listening to the symphony of snores and heartbreak. Eventually, she saved enough for a tiny rented room with cracked paint and a window that barely let in the light. Every evening, as she sat on the edge of her thin mattress, she would whisper a mantra to herself: surviving is not the same as living, but it is the road that leads there. In those years of silence, Amara's character underwent a profound transformation. She stopped waiting for the phone to ring. She stopped rehearsing the arguments she would have with Victor if she ever saw him again. She stopped waiting for an apology that would never come. Instead, she traded her tears for discipline. She began to notice the small things, the kindness of a baker who gave her an extra roll, the empathy of a stranger who held the door. She learned to keep her eyes steady and her voice soft. She discovered that the people the world ignores often see the most. While the world thought she was just a woman cleaning up after them, Amara was secretly reclaiming her power. She spent her few free hours in a small, dusty community center in the Afro-Korean district. There, she found an old master who saw past her worn shoes and tired eyes. "You move like someone who is afraid of the floor," he told her. "But the floor is the only thing that will always catch you. Use it." She began to train. In the humid heat of that basement, Amara found the kung fu in her blood. Every strike was a release of the shame Victor had heaped upon her. Every block was a wall she built to protect the heart she had once given away so cheaply. She wasn't just building muscle, she was building a fortress of trust in herself. 5 years later, the invisible woman was gone. In her place stood someone forged in the fires of struggle and polished by the grace of survival. Amara walked into the Grand Mall, the site of her greatest humiliation, not as a victim, but as a queen of her own making. The daylight she once sought for safety now felt like her own personal spotlight. She walked past the high-end boutiques where she once felt small, her head held high with a quiet awe for how far she had come. She passed a man in a tailored suit, barking orders into a phone. It was Victor. He looked exactly the same, expensive, loud, and utterly hollow. As he turned, his eyes brushed over her, and for a split second, he paused. He saw the beauty, the poise, and the unmistakable aura of power radiating from her. He didn't recognize her, but he felt the magnetic pull of her strength. He smiled that predatory, confident smile. "Excuse me, do I know you?" Amara didn't flinch. She didn't feel the old gravity of her past pulling her down. Instead, she felt a wave of gratitude for the struggle that had made her this version of herself. "No," she said, her voice a steady, musical chime. "You knew a girl who believed your lies. I am the woman who survived them." As she walked away, leaving him grasping at a memory he couldn't quite catch, the mall music seemed to swell into a victory march. Amara Cole was no longer surviving. She was finally, beautifully, living. Before we begin this journey of resilience and justice, take a moment to like and subscribe if you believe that no matter how hard you fall, you have the power to rise higher than those who pushed you. Amara Cole once believed in a version of love that felt like a shield. To her, love was the promise that she would never have to face the biting chill of poverty or the crushing weight of loneliness alone again. As a woman who had spent most of her life feeling invisible, a face lost in the crowd, meeting Victor Hale felt like finally being seen. Victor was everything Amara wasn't. He was the product of old money, polished shoes, and a smile that seemed to open every door in the city. When he looked at her, he didn't see a girl struggling to find her footing, he saw someone he could rescue. For a time, Amara felt chosen. She felt safe. She trusted him with her heart, her future, and her dignity. But trust is a fragile thing when it is placed in the hands of a man who values status more than soul. As Victor's business empire began to rise, his heart began to shrink. His social circle sharpened into a blade of elite connections and high-profile galas. Suddenly, Amara's quiet kindness wasn't enough. Her background, which he once found charming, was now a source of embarrassment. The man who once promised to protect her began to look at her with a cold, clinical disdain. To Victor, Amara was no longer a partner, she was a weight, holding him back from the stratosphere of power he craved. The end didn't come with a long discussion or a tearful goodbye. It happened on an afternoon just as bright and cruel as the one she was currently standing in. Under the unforgiving glare of the sun, Victor looked at her with eyes that had turned to stone. "I can't carry you anymore, Amara," he said, his voice devoid of even the mercy of anger. "You don't fit the life I'm building." By nightfall, the locks were changed. Amara stood on the sidewalk with a single suitcase and a shattered spirit. She was back to being invisible, cast out into a world that didn't care if she disappeared. Most people would have broken. For months, Amara lived in the hollow spaces of the city, surviving on the empathy of strangers and the burning embers of her own shame. But it was in those dark moments that she found something Victor could never buy. She remembered the stories her grandfather told her about their ancestors, warriors who didn't fight for glory, but for survival. She began to train. In the early morning mist of public parks and the cramped corners of community gyms, Amara transformed. She studied the ancient art of kung fu, blending it with a modern, fierce resilience. Every punch was a release of her past, every block was a shield against the man who tried to delete her existence. She wasn't just learning to fight, she was learning to be whole. She found a community of invisible people who traded kindness like currency, and for the first time, Amara understood that true power doesn't come from a bank account, it comes from the soul. 5 years passed. Amara was no longer the girl with the suitcase. She was a woman of mystery, a silent force in the martial arts world, and a person who had built a life on her own terms. Fate, however, loves a full circle. Walking through the Grand Mall today, the sunlight through the skylights felt like a spotlight. And there, standing near the fountain, was Victor. He looked older, his face etched with the stress of maintaining a hollow empire. When he saw her, he didn't recognize the weight he had discarded. He only saw a woman of immense poise and striking beauty. He approached her, that same confident smile plastered on his face. "Have we met?" he asked, his voice dripping with the same practiced charm. Amara looked him dead in the eye. She didn't feel anger. She felt awe at how small he truly was. She didn't feel the need to scream. She felt the quiet, devastating power of someone who has survived the worst and come out gold. "You once told me I was a weight you couldn't carry," she said softly, the mall falling silent around them. "I just wanted to thank you. Because of you, I learned how to carry myself." As she walked away, leaving him stunned in the very light he thought he owned, Amara realized that her past didn't define her. It was the fuel for her fire. Amara Cole had spent years being the invisible girl. After Victor Hale, the man she thought was her protector, cast her out into the street like an outdated accessory, she stopped looking for a savior. She realized that if she was ever going to be rescued, she would have to be the one to do it. She focused on a single, unwavering goal, becoming someone she could respect. The years of struggle were her forge. Every morning at the bakery, every afternoon scrubbing the floors of people who wouldn't even look her in the eye, she was building a fortress of internal dignity. She learned to find gratitude in the smallest things, the warmth of a fresh oven, the steady rhythm of her own breathing, the fact that she was still standing. She didn't know it yet, but the universe was preparing her for a collision of fates that would change the city forever. Change rarely arrives with a trumpet blast, it usually enters on an ordinary afternoon, quiet as a shadow. Amara was delivering a tray of artisan pastries to a modest import office on the edge of the Afro-Korean district. It was a routine task, but as she entered the room, the air seemed to shift. That was the day she met Minho Jae-kwon. Minho didn't look like the powerful man Amara had known. He didn't wear his wealth like a weapon, he carried himself with a terrifyingly calm stillness. He was quiet and observant, sitting behind a desk that looked too simple for a man of his presence. When Amara set the tray down, he didn't treat her like a delivery girl. He looked her in the eye and thanked her. For the first time in 5 years, Amara felt seen. Not as a victim or a servant, but as a human being. Over the next few months, Minho became a fixture in her life. He was the man who remembered her name. He was the man who asked how her day was and actually waited for the answer. Their relationship didn't start with grand gestures, it started with kindness. Kindness turned into empathy, as they both realized they were people who had survived storms the world knew nothing about. Amara saw the way Minho treated his employees, with a fierce, protective loyalty. Minho saw the fire in Amara's eyes, the way she moved with the hidden grace of a warrior. Slowly, the walls Amara had built around her heart began to crack. Trust, something she thought Victor had killed forever, began to bloom like a flower in the sidewalk. And eventually, trust became love. What Amara didn't know was that the quiet businessman she was falling for was a man of legend. In the dark corners of Seoul and the underground markets of the city, the name Jae-kwon was spoken in whispers. Minho had been raised in a world of ruthless violence. He was a man who had clawed his way to the top of a powerful syndicate, earning a reputation as a mafia boss, not because he was cruel, but because he was untouchable. He had eventually stepped back, choosing the light of legitimate business over the darkness of bloodshed. But his past followed him like a second skin, a shadow he could never fully escape. He was a lion who had chosen peace, but he still had the heart of a predator for anyone who dared to threaten what was his. When Minho asked Amara to marry him, he didn't offer her a life of ease. He offered her a partnership. He told her about his shadows, and in return, she told him about hers. She told him about Victor, the mall, the suitcase, and the years of being told she was worthless. Minho's reaction wasn't one of pity. It was a cold, focused awe for her resilience. They didn't know they were trying to bury a diamond, he told her, his voice like velvet over steel. From now on, the world will know exactly who you are. They married in a ceremony that was private but carried the weight of a royal coronation. Amara, the woman who once slept in shelters, was now the wife of the most feared and respected power broker in the region. But she didn't lose herself in his shadow. She became his equal, the queen to his king. The story comes full circle on an afternoon just as bright as the day she was discarded. Amara and Minho were walking through the Grand Mall, the same mall where Victor had once pushed her into the glass. Victor was there, holding court with a group of investors, still playing the role of the big man. When he saw Amara, he recognized her this time. He saw the designer silk, the diamonds, and the undeniable aura of power. Thinking he could still bully her, he stepped forward with a smirk. Amara, well, look at you. I see you found a new way to pay the bills. I told you that you were a weight, but I didn't think you'd find someone to carry you so well. The air in the mall went dead cold. Minho stepped forward. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. The moment Victor looked into Minho's eyes, the smirk vanished. He realized he wasn't looking at a new boyfriend. He was looking at the man who owned the debt on his buildings, the man who controlled his supply lines, and the man who could end his career with a nod. You must be Victor, Minho said, his voice terrifyingly calm. I've heard so much about you. Mostly about your lack of vision. You saw wait, where I saw a masterpiece. Minho placed a hand on Amara's waist, a gesture of absolute possession and respect. You didn't just lose a wife, Victor. You lost the only thing that ever made you look like a good man. Now, move aside. You're blocking my wife's light. As they walked past, leaving Victor trembling in the very sunlight he thought he owned, Amara felt a surge of pure surprise at her own peace. She didn't need Victor's ruin to feel whole, her redemption was already complete. She wasn't a victim. She wasn't a survivor. She was a master. Amara Cole's second life didn't begin with a roar, it began with a whisper of hope. After years of enduring the cold, calculating cruelty of Victor Hale, a man who treated people like stepping stones, Amara had finally found a sanctuary. She married Minho Jae Kwon in a ceremony that felt like a healing ritual. There were no flashing cameras, no social climbing guests, and no pretension. There was only the warmth of the afternoon sun and the quiet, ironclad promises of a man who understood the weight of a broken past. Minho, a man whose name was feared in the shadows but respected in the light, looked at Amara not as a trophy, but as a masterpiece of resilience. He vowed that day not just to love her, but to be the shield behind which she could finally learn to breathe. He wanted to protect the life she was still cautiously, beautifully, learning to believe she deserved. Recovery is not a straight line, it is a series of brave moments. For years, Amara had been a shadow, a habit formed by the necessity of survival. But on this particular Tuesday, she decided to do something that still felt like a mountain. She went to the mall alone. She wasn't there to shop for designer handbags or to flaunt her new status. She was there for someone else. Amara spent her free time volunteering at a local community center, a place filled with children who, like her, had been overlooked by the world. She wanted to find a specific gift for a young girl who had just passed her first martial arts grading, a small token to remind her that she was seen. Amara dressed in the way she felt most comfortable, simple clothes, no jewelry, and her hair pulled back. It was the uniform of her years of caution, a way to move through the world without drawing the predatory gaze of men like Victor. She didn't realize that her humility would be the very thing that set a trap for a ghost from her past. The Grand Mall was bustling, a cathedral of glass and consumerism. Amara was walking toward a small toy boutique, her mind focused on the joy she was about to provide. She moved with a quiet grace, unaware that behind her, the very embodiment of her nightmares was approaching. Victor Hale was walking with the gait of a man who believed he owned the floor beneath his feet. He was flanked by assistants, barking orders into a phone, his ego fueled by a recent string of business acquisitions. To Victor, the mall wasn't a public space, it was his runway. Amara, paused for a moment to check her list, was inadvertently in his way. Victor didn't see a face. He didn't see a woman with a story. He saw an obstacle. He saw someone dressed in cheap clothing who was moving too slowly for his frantic, important life. In that moment, the entitlement that had defined his life flared into a familiar, ugly anger. With a sneer of disgust, Victor didn't ask her to move. He reacted with the same casual force he had used 5 years ago when he threw her out of his home. He shoved her shoulder, hard. The force sent Amara stumbling. The polished marble floor, once so intimidating, became a slide as she crashed into a crystal display case. The sound was deafening, a sickening shatter of glass that echoed through the atrium like a gunshot. The mall went silent. Shoppers froze. The sunlight pouring through the skylights felt like a heavy, judgmental spotlight. Amara lay on the floor, the shards of glass glittering around her like fallen stars. Her first instinct wasn't anger, it was the old, familiar sting of empathy for the girl she used to be. Victor stood over her, his face flushed with a dark, arrogant satisfaction. Learn to stay out of the way of people who actually have somewhere to be, he spat, still not looking at her face. Then, Amara looked up. As her eyes met Victor's, the air seemed to leave his lungs. The poorly dressed stranger was the woman he had discarded like trash. But the woman on the floor didn't have the eyes of a victim anymore. There was no fear. There was only a calm, devastating awe at his pathetic inability to change. Victor, she said softly. The sound of his name coming from her lips made him flinch as if he'd been struck. Before he could speak, the heavy glass doors of the entrance swung open. A team of security detail, dressed in sharp black suits, moved with a precision that signaled the arrival of someone truly powerful. At the center of the formation was Minho. He didn't look at the crowd. He didn't look at the broken glass. His eyes were locked on Amara. The shift in the room was palpable. Victor, who thought he was the most important man in the building, suddenly looked like a child playing dress-up. He knew Minho Jae-kwon. Everyone in the city knew that to cross Minho was to invite a storm that no amount of money could weather. Minho reached Amara, ignored the glass, and knelt beside her. He took her hand with a tenderness that brought tears to the eyes of the onlookers. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice a low rumble of protective fury. "I'm okay, Minho," she whispered, standing up with his help. She dusted off her simple coat, her dignity radiating more brightly than any diamond. "He just reminded me why I'm so grateful for the life we have now." Minho turned to Victor. He didn't touch him. He didn't have to. The look in Minho's eyes was enough to make Victor's empire feel like a house of cards. "You have a habit of breaking things that don't belong to you," Minho said, his voice terrifyingly calm. "But today, you made a mistake you can't buy your way out of. You didn't just shove a woman. You shoved my wife." The mall erupted in whispers. The worthless ex was now the wife of the city's most powerful broker. The surprise on Victor's face was the ultimate karma. He had spent his life trying to be the biggest person in the room, only to realize he was the smallest. Amara didn't stay to watch him crumble. She had a gift to buy. She had a life to live. As she walked out of the mall, hand in hand with a man who truly saw her, she realized that the glass hadn't broken her, it had simply reflected the light of the woman she had become. The grand atrium was a cathedral of glass and light, a place where the wealthy came to see and be seen. Amara Cole moved through the crowd like a whisper, quiet, unassuming, and dressed in the simple clothes of a woman who valued peace over prestige. She was there to buy a small gift for a child at the community center, a tiny act of kindness that defined her new life. She didn't hear him coming. She only felt the sudden, violent jolt of a shoulder slamming into hers. The force was intentional, fueled by the casual arrogance of a man who believed the world was his private hallway. Amara stumbled, her feet losing their grip on the polished marble. She crashed into a crystal display case, the sound of shattering glass exploding through the mall like a thunderclap. As she lay there, the air knocked out of her, a heavy boot connected with her side, a cruel, dismissive kick to move her out of the way. "Get up, you pathetic waste of space," a voice hissed. The mall froze. Strangers stopped in their tracks, caught in that agonizing bridge between shock and intervention. But for Amara, the world didn't just stop, it rewound. The voice was a jagged blade she hadn't felt in 5 years. She looked up through the shimmering shards of glass and saw him, Victor Hale. He looked exactly the same. The tailored suit, the cold eyes, the mouth twisted in a permanent sneer of entitlement. To him, she was just a poorly dressed woman, blocking his path. He hadn't even looked at her face before he struck. He had reacted with the same instinctive cruelty he used years ago when he threw her and her single suitcase onto a rain-slicked curb, calling her worthless and a weight he could no longer carry. For a heartbeat, the old darkness threatened to swallow her. The familiar ache of being treated as nothing pulled at her spirit, whispering that she was still that broken girl. But Amara was no longer that girl. She didn't scream. She didn't beg. She lay still for a moment, not because she was broken, but because she was letting the past touch her one last time before she burned it to the ground. Slowly, Amara pushed herself up. Her hands shook, but not with fear, they shook with the restrained power of a kung fu master who had spent 5 years turning her pain into a weapon. She rose from the floor with a fluid, haunting grace that made the onlookers catch their breath. When she finally stood, she didn't look down. She lifted her chin and looked Victor directly in the eyes. Victor's face tightened. He was prepared for a scene, for a woman to cry or demand money. He was not prepared for the awe-inspiring stillness of the woman before him. Memory finally caught up with him. The confusion on his features flickered like a dying candle before turning into a mask of pure shock. He saw her then, really saw her. He looked for the weak wife he had discarded, but she wasn't there. Amara stood tall, her eyes reflecting the bright afternoon sun like polished steel. She wasn't small. She wasn't crying. She was a mountain, and he was just a grain of sand. Amara, he whispered, his voice cracking. The entitlement was gone, replaced by an unsettling fear. He realized he wasn't looking at a victim, he was looking at a reckoning. You always did have a habit of looking through people, Victor, Amara said, her voice steady and clear, carrying to every witness in the atrium. You thought you broke me 5 years ago. You thought you could kick me aside today and the world would just keep turning. She stepped forward, and for the first time in his life, Victor Hale took a step back. But I learned something in the years you were gone, she continued, her voice dropping to a dangerous, melodic silk. I learned that the people you think are nothing, are usually the ones carrying the most weight. And today, you've finally met a weight you aren't strong enough to carry. The crowd murmured in surprise as the mall's heavy security doors opened. But they weren't there for Amara. A man stepped through, Minho J. Kwan, the city's most feared power broker and Amara's husband. He didn't need to say a word. The sheer presence of the man who truly loved and protected Amara made Victor's empire look like a child's toy. Minho walked straight to Amara, ignoring the shattered glass, and draped his coat over her shoulders. It was an act of profound empathy and protection that left the audience in a state of gratitude for the justice they were witnessing. Minho turned his gaze to Victor. It wasn't a look of anger, it was a look of absolute, soul-crushing pity. You should have stayed in the shadows, Victor, Minho said quietly. Because in the light, everyone can see just how small you really are. As Amara walked away, hand in hand with her husband, she felt a wave of hope for every person who had ever been told they were invisible. She didn't need to strike a single blow to win the fight. Her resilience was her victory. Her silence was her strength. And her life was her masterpiece. Victor stood alone in the center of the mall, surrounded by the wreckage he had created, finally understanding that the woman he called worthless was the only priceless thing he ever had. She stood with quiet dignity in the middle of the crowd, daylight outlining her strength. Security arrived and whispers spread. Phones were raised, recording a story that was already turning. Amara declined attention, declined anger, and simply asked to leave. She walked out into the sunlit parking lot, each step a refusal to be defined by the violence done to her. What Victor did not know was that the mall was already surrounded by unseen eyes. Minje's people did not interfere, not because they did not care, but because they trusted Amara's strength and believed justice could be clean, not loud. The aftermath unfolded in daylight boardrooms and quiet offices. Victor's company began to unravel as partners withdrew, contracts vanished and investigations surfaced, each one linked to past misconduct that had been ignored. Before we conclude this epic journey of a woman who turned a shattered past into a masterpiece of peace, take a moment to like and subscribe. If you believe that the greatest victory isn't defeating your enemy, but outgrowing them entirely, then this final chapter is for you. The downfall of Victor Hale didn't happen with a cinematic explosion or a public execution. It happened with a quiet, devastating clarity. In the days following the incident at the mall, Victor waited for the retaliation. He expected the legendary Minho J. Kwan to send men to his door. He expected threats, violence, and the chaotic vengeance of the underworld. But the silence was much louder than a threat. Minho did something that Victor, in all his narrow-minded greed, could never comprehend. He didn't use his power to crush Victor, he simply stopped using his power to protect him. He allowed the truth to breathe. Without the shield of high-level connections and the blind eye of silent partners, Victor's empire began to evaporate under the harsh, honest light of day. Amara watched from the quiet sanctuary of her new life, learning the most profound lesson of all: real power doesn't need to announce itself. It doesn't need to shout, shove, or kick. True power is the ability to walk away and let the universe finish the conversation you started. While Victor's world was shrinking, Amara's was expanding in ways that brought her a sense of awe. She returned to her routines, not out of necessity, but out of gratitude. She returned to the bakery where the smell of flour reminded her of her survival. She returned to the community center where her kindness was now a lighthouse for others who felt invisible. She realized that healing wasn't a dramatic event. It wasn't a light bulb moment or a sudden disappearance of scars. It was steady. It was patient. It was deeply, beautifully human. Every morning, when the sunlight hit the floor of her kitchen, Amara felt a surge of hope. She no longer checked the news for Victor's name. She no longer felt the gravity of the mall incident pulling at her shoulders. She was busy building a legacy of trust, not just with Minho, but with herself. She was learning to believe, truly and fully, that she deserved the peace she had found. On the other side of the city, Victor Hale sat in an office that felt more like a cage every day. His partners had vanished. His credit had dried up. His friends no longer answered his calls. Stripped of his illusions of grandeur, he found himself haunted by a single image: Amara standing in the mall, surrounded by glass, looking at him not with anger, but with pity. He tried to understand how the woman he once discarded like a broken toy had risen into a life he could no longer touch. How had the weight become the mountain? Regret finally arrived. It was late, and it was heavy. It sat in his chest like lead. He found himself driving past the community center, watching from a distance as Amara laughed with the children, her movements fluid and free. He wanted to apologize. He wanted to explain. He wanted to reclaim even a sliver of the grace she radiated. But he found no door open to him. He realized that while he was busy trying to keep her down, she had climbed to a height where his voice could no longer reach. One evening, Minho found Amara sitting on their balcony, watching the city lights flicker to life. "Do you still think about him?" he asked gently, his hand resting on hers in a gesture of absolute empathy. "I did today," Amara admitted softly. "I saw him near the center. He looked like he wanted to say something." Minho's eyes darkened for a split second, but Amara squeezed his hand. "I realized I've already forgiven him, Minho," she said, her voice filled with a calm that was more powerful than any martial arts strike. "Not for his sake. Not because he deserves it. But for my own peace. I don't want to carry his ghost in my heart anymore." In that moment, Amara reached the final stage of her martial arts redemption. She learned that forgiveness does not require reconciliation. You can forgive a person and still choose to never see them again. You can forgive the past and still leave it exactly where it belongs, behind you. Amara Cole was no longer the kung fu master's wife, though she was proud of her husband. She was no longer the abuse survivor, though that was part of her history. She was Amara. As the stars came out over the city, she stood up and practiced a slow, meditative form. Her movements were a silent prayer of gratitude to the girl with the suitcase, the woman with the cleaning supplies, and the fighter in the basement. They had all played their part in creating the woman who stood there now, unshakable, untouchable.